The air was thick and tasted of damp plaster, stale tobacco, and the acrid tang of fear. Outside, the sounds of post-war rebuilding, a rhythmic hammer, the groan of a truck engine, provided a monotonous counterpoint to the tense silence within. Major Alan Breck, an MI6 operative whose starched collar seemed a defiant rejection of the room's decay, leaned back in a rickety wooden chair. He hadn't slept properly in 48 hours, but his eyes, sharp and the color of glacier ice, remained fixed on the table where the evidence lay, a pile of gear confiscated from a recently detained KGB agent named Borodin. Borodin, a man whose skin looked permanently dusted with coal ash and whose suit hung on him like a sack, sat opposite, his wrists cuffed to the heavy, scarred oak. He stared at the floor, occasionally shifting his weight, the scrape of his boots the only significant sound until Breck decided to break the silence. "Tell me about this, Borodin," Breck said, his voice a smooth, upper-class baritone, completely at odds with the guttural German he was speaking. He didn't wait for an answer, instead nudging an object across the table with the tip of his swagger stick. The object was the reason Breck was so exhausted, but also the reason for his quiet, almost detached amusement. It was a listening device, yes, but one that seemed to belong to an earlier century. The thing was housed in a cheap, wooden box, barely disguised as a cigar humidor, and the electronics inside were a clumsy array of bulky vacuum tubes, thick, badly soldered wires, and a massive, low-quality reel-to-reel mechanism. The whole ensemble hummed audibly, a giveaway to anyone within 10 feet, and was powered by a stack of bulky, unreliable lead-acid batteries that took up more space than the recording apparatus itself. The microphone, a simple carbon button model, was visible if you looked closely enough at a tiny, poorly drilled hole in the wood grain. It was heavy, primitive, and completely reliant on a direct, if temporary, physical connection to a power source and a manual retrieval team. Breck's colleague, Captain Philip Davies, a signals intelligence officer with a nervous tic and a PhD in electrical engineering from Cambridge, couldn't help but snort softly from his corner of the room. Davies pointed to a particularly ugly piece of exposed wiring. "Look at that, Alan. The sheer crudity of it. The amplifier gain is nonlinear, the frequency response is appalling, and the static from the power supply must have drowned out half their own recordings. Our earliest wartime apparatus was more sophisticated than this, and they call themselves a global power." Davies shook his head, a mixture of professional pride and intellectual condescension heavy in his voice. Breck permitted himself a small, weary smile. This was the prevalent attitude throughout the Western intelligence community in the late 1940s. The Soviet Union, they believed, was a powerhouse of brute military force and monolithic propaganda. But its espionage technology was years behind the curve, constrained by material shortages and a command and control economy that stifled true innovation. They relied on wires, simple acoustics, and bulky radio transmitters, devices that required heavy maintenance, constant physical access, and an obvious, traceable power source. The entire apparatus of Soviet espionage in this technical sphere seemed to be built on an assumption of mass-produced, expendable simplicity rather than elegant, miniaturized stealth. Borodin finally lifted his head, his eyes meeting Breck's. The look was one of exhausted resignation, but beneath it, Breck saw a flicker of something he couldn't quite place. Was it simple defeat, or was it a deeper, more private knowledge? Breck dismissed the thought. He was overanalyzing. The evidence was right there on the table, a testament to KGB's technological limitations. The British and American services, with their miniaturized crystal radios, quartz-stabilized transmitters, and secure line scramblers, were operating on a different plane entirely. They were the inheritors of the wartime decryption breakthroughs, the pioneers of the transistor, and they held an undisputed technical advantage. That advantage, in the cold, escalating war of secrets, was their shield and their source of professional arrogance. They laughed at the crude bugs of the KGB. They truly believed they had nothing to fear from Soviet technology, a belief that, in less than 5 years, would be utterly devastatingly shattered by a simple wooden plaque hanging on a wall thousands of miles away. The smugness of that small, smoky room in Berlin, the confident dismissal of a captured cigar box bug, was the very blindness that the enemy was banking on. August 21st, 1950. Spaso House, the U.S. ambassador's residence, Moscow. 2 years had passed since Major Breck's interrogation in Berlin, and the locus of the Cold War had shifted decisively to the enemy's heartland. Moscow was a city of stark, monumental architecture and constant, unsettling surveillance. The U.S. ambassador's residence, Spaso House, a magnificent pre-revolutionary mansion, stood in stark contrast to the Soviet grayness, but it was no sanctuary. It was a fortress of secrets, surrounded not by stone walls, but by concentric rings of hostile curiosity. Inside, the official mood was one of sustained, low-level paranoia. Every item brought into the compound, from imported diplomatic pouches to sacks of potatoes, was assumed to have been tampered with. Every maintenance worker was a potential informant. The KGB surveillance doctrine was less about subtlety and more about overwhelming, constant pressure. They didn't just try to listen. They simply assumed they were listening and broadcast that capability as a form of psychological warfare. Ambassador George Kennan, famous as the intellectual father of the containment doctrine, was highly attuned to the atmosphere. His secure meetings were never held at his main office or drawing room. Instead, key policy discussions, especially those concerning sensitive information like NATO planning or intelligence reports on Soviet atomic capacity, were relegated to a specially built, windowless, and electronically shielded bubble room in the basement. This room was a metal cage, lined with copper mesh and soundproofing, designed to defeat any crude Soviet bug or RF eavesdropping attempt. Precisely the kind of vacuum tube monstrosities British intelligence had dismissed in Berlin. Despite the precautions, the sense of being listened to was pervasive. The security team at the embassy, tasked with regular counter-surveillance sweeps, had become numb to the discoveries. They routinely found the expected: cheap contact microphones jammed behind the wallpaper of non-critical offices, poorly concealed wires running through the mortar of the exterior walls, and radio transmitters hidden in the plumbing, all easily detected by standard Western sweep equipment, which was constantly on the lookout for a power signature, a measurable heat emission, or an RF broadcast. The equipment was heavy, but effective against what they expected to find. Chief Security Officer Wally Reed, a Marine with a decade in counterintelligence, knew that the KGB's approach was often to flood the zone with expendable, low-tech devices, hoping one would survive the sweep long enough to catch a snippet of useful chatter. It was a numbers game, a reflection, they thought, of the Soviet lack of technical finesse. The technical briefing notes prepared for Reed from Washington reflected this continued technical hubris. Subject devices are generally powered by heavy, perishable batteries or crude wiring, one memorandum stated. Sweep protocols should focus on thermal and electromagnetic leakage. Due to known Soviet limitations in miniaturization, highly passive, non-power devices are improbable. This prevailing wisdom was based on solid, if dangerously incomplete, data. The KGB was utilizing those crude bugs. They were focused on easily detected power sources and transmissions. But out of sight, in a deeply secret research laboratory located just outside Moscow, a scientist named Leon Theremin, a name known globally for his musical instrument, the theremin, but unknown in the West for his espionage innovations, was working on something radically different. Something that did not hum, did not require a battery, did not transmit a traditional RF signal, and was essentially invisible to every sweep protocol the Americans were currently using. The scene was set. The Americans were looking for a tank with a chimney, while the Soviets were preparing to introduce a silent arrow. August 4th, 1952. The ambassador's reception room, Spaso House, Moscow. The atmosphere was carefully orchestrated sentimentality, a brief, fragile thaw in the Cold War's diplomatic frost. Ambassador Kennan was hosting a small, carefully vetted delegation of high-achieving Soviet schoolchildren and young pioneers, accompanied by their handlers, of course. The event was pure propaganda, designed to showcase the supposed friendship between the two nations, despite the geopolitical deadlock in Korea and the escalating nuclear arms race. Kennan played his role with practiced, weary geniality, understanding that every smile, every handshake was being meticulously documented for the Kremlin's purposes. The culmination of the small ceremony was the presentation of a gift. A group of 4 children, scrubbed clean, dressed in neatly pressed uniforms, and taught their lines by rote, stepped forward. They presented the ambassador with a hand-carved, heavy wooden seal bearing the Great Seal of the United States. It was made of several different types of wood, polished to a dull sheen, and was about 1.5 feet in diameter. The eagle and shield were rendered in painstaking, artisanal detail. The children explained, through a translator whose loyalty was undoubtedly to the KGB, that it was a symbol of goodwill, lovingly crafted by the students themselves. Kennan was charmed by the gesture, or at least, he appeared to be. The wood smelled faintly of linseed oil and was heavy, giving it a reassuringly authentic feel. It seemed like the perfect, innocuous diplomatic ornament, a heavy, non-electronic piece of folk art. Security officer Wally Reed and his team observed the presentation from the perimeter of the room. They had cleared the children and their handlers long before they entered the residence. The gift itself had been inspected, not for electronic devices, which the wood clearly couldn't hide without being ridiculously obvious, but for conventional threats, poison, biological agents, or hidden microdots. The inspection was perfunctory. Reed, relying on the standing technical advisories, had not subjected the plaque to an electromagnetic sweep. Why would he? It was a hunk of wood. It had no power source. It gave off no heat. It contained no obvious metallic components that would interfere with RF transmission or reception. To the American technical eye, it was dead. The ambassador was photographed holding the seal, smiling broadly. Later that day, Kennan instructed his staff to find a prominent, appropriate place for the thoughtful gift. Naturally, given the significance of the diplomatic exchange, the most appropriate place was deemed to be the ambassador's private study, directly behind his massive mahogany desk, on the high wall overlooking his main working chair. It was the perfect spot, visible in all official photographs, and positioned precisely above the spot where the ambassador held his sensitive, unshielded conversations with his most trusted staff. Conversations he thought were safe because he had specifically instructed the room to be swept for powered bugs and because the sensitive policy discussions were confined to the basement's secure bubble. The wooden seal, now hanging innocuously high on the wall, seemed to watch the room. It had required no batteries, no visible wires, and no complex installation. It was simply placed on the wall with 2 sturdy picture hooks. The act of placing it there, a casual gesture of diplomatic courtesy, was the final, crucial step in completing what was perhaps the most ingenious and technologically advanced eavesdropping operation of the Cold War. October 15, 1952. The ambassador's study, Spaso House, Moscow. The Russian autumn had fully set in, casting long, weak shadows across the ornate carpets of Spaso House. Inside the ambassador's study, the air was warm, almost stuffy, a stark contrast to the biting wind outside. Ambassador Kennan was on the telephone, his voice low and urgent, discussing recent intelligence reports with a high-ranking State Department official in Washington. The conversation was about Soviet troop movements near the Austrian border, a delicate topic that usually warranted the secure line in the bubble room. However, this was a quick, tactical update, and Kennan, believing his study to be free of electronic surveillance, had opted for convenience. High above his head, the wooden seal bearing the Great Seal of the United States hung silently. To the naked eye, it was just an ornament, a static piece of wood. But inside its intricately carved surface, concealed within the hollowed-out section of the eagle's beak, lay the core of the Soviet Union's most audacious and revolutionary eavesdropping device. This device, later famously dubbed the Thing by Western intelligence, was a masterpiece of clandestine engineering. It consisted of a tiny, cylindrical resonant cavity, essentially a miniature microphone diaphragm attached to a small, adjustable antenna. It had no power source of its own, no wires leading to it, and no active transmitting components in the conventional sense. It was a passive device, an acoustic sensor designed to be remotely activated and interrogated by a powerful, precisely tuned external microwave beam. Today, that external beam was active, unseen by anyone inside Space-O House. A black Volga sedan, fitted with a custom-built directional microwave transmitter, was parked discreetly on the street outside, its antenna aimed precisely at the ambassador's study window. The beam, a tightly focused electromagnetic energy pulse, penetrated the glass and struck the wooden seal. Upon impact, the energy from the microwave beam caused the tiny diaphragm within the seal to vibrate in response to the ambient sound waves within the ambassador's study. Kennan's voice, the rustle of his papers, the subtle creaks of the old mansion. These vibrations subtly altered the resonant frequency of the cavity. The microwave beam, now modulated by the audio vibrations, was then reflected back towards the Volga. Back in the sedan, a sophisticated receiver was tuned to capture this reflected, modulated beam. It then demodulated the microwave signal, converting the subtle frequency shift back into intelligible audio waves. A technician, headphones clamped over his ears, meticulously adjusted dials, filtering out static and enhancing the ambassador's voice. He was listening, in real time, to Kennan's conversation, clearly picking up every word as if he were in the room itself. The brilliance of the thing lay in its simplicity and its complete evasion of Western counter-surveillance protocols. Since it had no internal power, it emitted no heat signature. Since it was passive until activated, it generated no RF signal that could be detected by a sweep. It was quite literally an echo chamber waiting for an external sound to resonate and an external force to make it sing. The American intelligence services were searching for powered bugs that betrayed their presence through heat or continuous radio emissions. The thing operated on an entirely different principle, rendering all their existing sweep technology utterly useless. It was the ultimate invisible listener, a silent, wooden eye and ear that had found its perfect perch just above the head of the man who thought he was speaking in confidence. The conversations it captured would go far beyond troop movements, delving into the deepest strategic intentions of the United States. January 1956. CIA headquarters, Langley, Virginia. 4 years had passed since the gift of friendship was hung in Space-O House. Ambassador Kennan had long since moved on, replaced by other envoys, but the wooden seal remained, a permanent fixture in the ambassador's study. And for 4 years, the Soviets had enjoyed a privileged, continuous stream of intelligence directly from the heart of American diplomatic operations in Moscow. At Langley, the mood was one of escalating frustration and confusion. Key American diplomatic positions were being consistently and accurately countered by the Soviets. Negotiation stances were preempted. Classified movements were anticipated. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence or simple inference. It pointed to a profound, ongoing security breach in Moscow. Technical analysts at the CIA were re-evaluating every possible point of vulnerability. They reviewed the security logs from Space-O House, which showed regular, meticulous sweeps, daily, weekly, and monthly, conducted by the embassy's counterintelligence staff, led by Security Officer Reed. The logs confirmed that the usual KGB surveillance attempts, the crude, powered bugs, were routinely found and neutralized. The security team was confident they were defeating the known enemy. Yet, the leaks persisted, often involving information discussed casually outside the secure bubble room, specifically in the ambassador's study. The technical team in Washington, relying on the established dogma, initially blamed human error, a careless word at a cocktail party, a leaky typist, or a deep cover mole. They couldn't bring themselves to blame the technology. Their TSCM, technical surveillance countermeasures, equipment was state-of-the-art, constantly upgraded with directional antennas, spectrum analyzers, and infrared sensors. It was designed to find everything that broadcast everything that consumed power and everything that generated heat. The specific, recurring nature of the compromised information eventually forced a change in focus. A young CIA signal analysis officer named Robert Bob Stone, newly assigned to the European Division, began to compile a chilling pattern. The compromised data, Stone noted in a confidential memo, doesn't usually originate from documents or cables. It originates from unguarded conversation, and specifically from conversations held in the same physical location, the study, during times when the secure line isn't being used. Stone argued that the team was suffering from a failure of imagination. "We are looking for a power transmitter or a wired microphone," he wrote. "We need to consider a passive, non-powered acoustic device, something that doesn't broadcast, but rather reflects an external energy source." His proposal was initially met with skepticism. The prevailing opinion was that a reflected signal would be too weak, too unstable, and too difficult to tune to be practically useful for sustained eavesdropping. The notion was dismissed as theoretical, almost science fiction. But the leaks continued, and the geopolitical costs mounted. Eventually, the ambassador's urgent request for a complete, surgical tear-down and rebuild of the study's security became impossible to ignore. A specialized covert technical team was finally authorized to fly to Moscow, equipped with experimental, highly sensitive surveillance detection gear, equipment that could look for things that didn't exist according to the standard operating procedures. January 25, 1957, Sheremetyevo Airport, Moscow. The arrival of the three-person technical team was a model of calculated discretion. They traveled under the guise of State Department communications experts scheduled to upgrade the embassy's telegraph infrastructure, a cover story drab enough to be believable. The team was led by Dr. Peter Jensen, a physicist and engineer from the National Security Agency, NSA, whose work in microwave acoustics was cutting edge. With him were two senior technical operatives, both veterans of sensitive operations. Their cargo was the most important element. Several heavily crated pieces of equipment that looked like standard communications gear, but were, in fact, experimental counter-surveillance prototypes. The most critical piece was a newly developed, highly sensitive nonlinear junction detector, an LJD, designed to seek out non-powered electronic components, not just transistors or chips, but any junction of dissimilar materials that could rectify a radio wave, a technology then primarily used for finding hidden metallic wires in walls. Jensen had adapted it to be ultra-sensitive to the specific resonant frequencies often found in acoustic membranes. Upon their arrival at Spaso House, they immediately began their work. Security Officer Wally Reed met them, his demeanor a mixture of relief and deep professional frustration. "We've swept this room 100 times, Dr. Jensen. We've checked the power lines, the conduits, the furniture. We've even ripped out sections of the plaster, looking for wiring. Nothing. Just the usual crude garbage in the utility closets." Jensen, a quiet man whose intensity was focused entirely on the complex dials and readouts of his equipment, nodded, but offered no immediate reassurance. "I appreciate your thoroughness, Officer Reed, but we're not looking for the usual garbage. We're looking for a theoretical maximum, something that doesn't want to be found." They started the systematic sweep of the ambassador's study. The first pass was routine. Nothing on the floors, nothing in the lighting fixtures, nothing in the walls. Jensen then deployed his specialized gear. He used a broadband RF excitation source and then began sweeping the room with a modified NLJD. For hours, the device gave off only the expected background noise and the occasional flicker from a poorly shielded lamp cord. Jensen was meticulous, moving the detector across every surface, millimeter by millimeter. Finally, he approached the high wall behind the mahogany desk. His eyes were focused intently on the wall, but his feet stumbled over a small footstool placed beneath a large, decorative wooden seal. He paused, looking up at the heavy, hand-carved plaque, the gift of friendship. He dismissed it instinctively. It was just wood. He moved his antenna past it and back to the wallpaper. "Any luck, Doctor?" Reed asked, his hope waning. Jensen shook his head, about to answer, when his eyes drifted back to the plaque. The shape, the size, the prominent placement directly above the conversation area, something about it irritated the physicist in him. It was a perfect acoustic perch. He didn't believe for a moment that it held a battery or a wire, but he was hunting for a failure of imagination. He instructed his technician to carefully climb the stool and hold the NLJD's probe close to the wooden surface. As the probe drew within an inch of the carved eagle's head, the NLJD shrieked. It wasn't the sputtering noise of a faulty wire. It was a clear, strong, sustained harmonic signal. The signal was impossible, a clear electronic signature from an object that was supposed to be completely inert. Jensen froze, a cold certainty washing over him. The plaque was electronically alive, yet it had no perceptible power. The Soviets had not just concealed a bug. They had bypassed the fundamental principle of Western counterespionage technology. January 26, 1957. A secure lab in the basement of Spaso House. The wooden plaque, carefully removed from the ambassador's wall, now rested on a workbench under the intense, focused glare of a lab lamp. The technicians had immediately transported it to the most secure area of the residence, the windowless, shielded basement bubble room, now repurposed for investigation. Dr. Jensen, his technician, and a stunned Wally Reed gathered around it. The exterior was flawless, the artistry impressive. No seams, no screws, no wires protruding. It was a perfect, sealed piece of wood. "We need to go inside without destroying the evidence," Jensen stated, his voice tight with concentration. The objective was not just to find the bug, but to understand its mechanism and, crucially, to preserve it for analysis. A small, high-resolution X-ray machine, smuggled in with their equipment, was quickly set up. The first X-ray image of the seal provided the immediate, shocking confirmation. Deep within the heavy wood of the eagle's body, where the artisans had meticulously hollowed out the interior to fit different colored wood pieces for the shield design, there was a single, non-powered metallic object. It was cylindrical, about 7 inches long, and less than an inch wide. There were no visible batteries, no vacuum tubes, and no internal wires leading to an antenna. It was suspended in a void within the cavity. "It's hollow," Jensen murmured, tracing the outline on the X-ray plate with a gloved finger. "A resonator. It's a fundamental acoustic physics model, not a modern RF transmitter." Using precision dental tools and a small oscillating saw, the technicians carefully cut a thin, nearly invisible seam along the wooden grain, following the natural join of the different woods. When they pried open the section containing the eagle's beak, the device was revealed. It was exactly as the X-ray suggested, a small, silver-plated cylinder. At one end, there was a tiny, incredibly thin diaphragm, the microphone membrane, facing outward towards the room. Attached to the diaphragm was a short, straight antenna, less than an inch long. That was it. No power source, no complex circuitry, no wiring. Reed, who had hunted down countless bulky, powered Soviet bugs, simply stared. "It's nothing," he whispered, a deep professional humiliation settling over him. "For years, we swept this room religiously, looking for a bloody battery, and it was this thing." Jensen carefully measured the components. The entire device was a passive cavity resonator that operated on the principle of frequency modulation, FM. When exposed to an external, powerful microwave radio beam, the metal structure acted as a simple antenna, collecting the energy. The sound waves in the room caused the thin membrane to vibrate, which slightly changed the physical size of the resonant cavity, thus altering the frequency of the reflected radio wave. The intelligence lay not in the device itself, but in the sophisticated external interrogation equipment the KGB used to beam the microwave and decode the minuscule frequency shifts in the reflected signal. "They didn't just make a better bug, Wally," Jensen said, his voice now filled with professional, or rather than irritation. "They changed the rules of physics on us. We were listening for a radio broadcast. They invented a radio reflection. It's completely passive. It requires zero internal power. It's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant." He was looking at the future of espionage technology, delivered by a man the West only knew as a bizarre musical instrument inventor, Leon Theremin. The discovery was codenamed The Thing and was immediately classified at the highest levels. The ramifications for global intelligence security were immediate and devastating. Every embassy, every consulate, every secure room across the world that had been swept using traditional methods was now suspect. The realization that the Soviets possessed a device completely immune to standard Western countersurveillance techniques shattered the core belief in Western technological superiority. February 10, 1957. A highly secure briefing room, the Pentagon, Washington, D.C. The atmosphere in the Pentagon briefing room was grim. A small gathering of the highest-ranking officials from the CIA, NSA, FBI, and State Department sat in stunned silence as Dr. Jensen, flown back immediately from Moscow, presented the evidence. The wooden seal and a scaled-up, labeled diagram of the cavity resonator lay on the table. Jensen's presentation was clinical and unforgiving. He explained the mechanism, the need for an external, focused microwave beam, the passive nature of the reflection, and the complete lack of a power source. He stressed the technical brilliance behind the concept, which he attributed to years of dedicated, highly secretive Soviet research that had clearly bypassed their perceived economic and technological limitations. Gentlemen, Jensen concluded, pointing to the empty spot where the device had rested in the wood. We have spent the last decade secure in the belief that our advanced, transistor-based, miniaturized electronics gave us an insurmountable edge. We laughed at the KGB's vacuum tubes and lead-acid batteries. We defined espionage device by its need for power and its tendency to broadcast. This device, the Thing, operates entirely outside of those definitions. The immediate consequence was a complete, systemic failure of security assessment. Admiral Thompson, the NSA director, slammed his hand on the table. For years, we've been operating under the assumption of security in Moscow for 4 years, and the Soviets have had a clear, unencrypted line to every sensitive conversation held in the ambassador's private office. What classified information has been compromised? The answer they all knew was everything. Discussions about NATO's expansion strategy, internal policy debates on the Suez Crisis, assessments of Soviet rocket capabilities, and high-level decisions on disarmament negotiations. All were likely compromised. The ability of the U.S. to project an air of uncertainty or to surprise the Soviets in diplomatic negotiations had been severely undermined. The revelations struck particularly hard at the British delegation present. Major Alan Breck, now a senior MI6 liaison, recalled the cigar box bug in Berlin a decade earlier. He remembered the arrogant snort of Captain Davies, the smug certainty that Soviet technology was crude and decades behind. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. Their professional contempt for the KGB's technical capability had been weaponized against them. The immediate priority shifted to determining where else this technology had been deployed. If the Thing was in Moscow, it was almost certainly in other key embassies, London, Paris, Vienna. A global alert was issued, demanding that every embassy and consulate immediately retrieve and physically dismantle any non-electronic gifts received from the Soviet bloc over the last decade, particularly those made of wood or plaster. The discovery of the Thing was more than just the finding of a single listening device. It was a devastating psychological and technical defeat. It taught the Western powers that the Cold War wasn't just a contest of conventional technology, but a battle for conceptual superiority. The Soviets had not caught up. They had leaped ahead by reinventing the fundamental physics of covert listening. The professional arrogance of the earlier decade was replaced by a gnawing, deep-seated paranoia. The British delegation, particularly Major Alan Breck, recalled the cigar box bug in Berlin a decade earlier. He remembered the arrogant snort of Captain Davies, the smug certainty that Soviet technology was crude and decades behind. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. Their professional contempt for the KGB's technical capability had been weaponized against them. The immediate priority shifted to determining where else this technology had been deployed. If the thing was in Moscow, it was almost certainly in other key embassies, London, Paris, Vienna. A global alert was issued, demanding that every embassy and consulate immediately retrieve and physically dismantle any non-electronic gifts received from the Soviet bloc over the last decade, particularly those made of wood or plaster. The discovery of the thing was more than just the finding of a single listening device. It was a devastating psychological and technical defeat. It taught the Western powers that the Cold War wasn't just a contest of conventional technology, but a battle for conceptual superiority. The Soviets had not caught up. They had leaped ahead by reinventing the fundamental physics of covert listening. The professional arrogance of the earlier decade was replaced by a gnawing, deep-seated paranoia. March 5, 1957. NSA Technical Analysis Center, Fort Meade, Maryland. With the physical evidence of the thing now meticulously analyzed, the focus shifted to identifying the scientific architect behind it. The design was too elegant, too groundbreaking to have emerged from a bureaucratic, committee-driven state lab without a guiding genius. Analysts were tasked with reverse engineering the thought process. Dr. Jensen and his team determined that the core technology, the passive cavity resonator excited by an external RF field, was conceptually related to two seemingly disparate fields: early radio telegraphy and specialized musical acoustics. The key was the precise engineering of the diaphragm and the cavity to create a high-fidelity microphone that only reflected sound when interrogated by a specific microwave frequency. A small team of CIA historians and technical researchers, digging deep into pre-war Soviet émigré files and scientific publications, found a name that kept surfacing: Lev Sergeyevich Termin, known internationally as Leon Theremin. Theremin was famous in the West for inventing the theremin, the electronic musical instrument played without physical contact, which generated sound through the manipulation of radio waves and electrical fields. He had worked in New York for a decade in the 1930s, captivating audiences and even patenting several electronic surveillance devices before mysteriously returning to the Soviet Union in 1938, a return often speculated to be an abduction. Western intelligence had presumed he had fallen victim to Stalin's purges or was simply working on non-military technology in obscurity. The researchers uncovered classified Soviet documentation seized during post-war operations that placed Theremin not in a music conservatory, but in the Tupolev Sharashka, a secret research facility within the prison system, where he was tasked with developing security and surveillance technology. His expertise was in electromagnetic fields and wave manipulation, the precise discipline needed to design the thing. "It makes sickening sense," remarked a CIA historian. The man who invented the instrument that reads the proximity of a human hand to an electrical field also invented the device that reads the proximity of a sound wave to a radio field. He adapted his acoustic and electromagnetic mastery for espionage. It was a perfect operational cover. Theremin's early designs, including concepts for passive electronic tags and remote sensors, showed a clear, decades-long progression toward the cavity resonator principle. He had been quietly perfecting the technology while the West focused on transistors and bulky transmitters. The KGB had successfully utilized a genius whose name the West knew, but whose true capabilities they had catastrophically misjudged. The revelation of Theremin's involvement brought an added layer of psychological defeat. It meant the technical breach was not a fluke, but the product of a brilliant, sustained, and highly secretive research program dating back to the pre-war era. The KGB's crude bugs were a deliberate operational decoy, designed to draw Western attention to a low-tech threat, while the true, revolutionary technology was quietly installed at the highest level of vulnerability. The arrogance of laughing at their supposed backwardness had created the perfect four-year window of opportunity. April 1957. U.S. Embassy, London. The discovery of the thing triggered an immediate, expensive, and logistically nightmarish global response. The old policy of searching for powered, transmitting devices was abandoned overnight. A new, radical counter-surveillance doctrine, codenamed Operation ER Stop, was implemented across all Western diplomatic missions. The first step was a massive, systematic purge of all non-electronic diplomatic gifts, furnishings, and decorative items received from Soviet bloc nations. Teams, equipped with Dr. Jensen's modified NLJD technology, traveled globally. In London, Major Breck, the MI6 liaison from the Berlin days, now found himself working directly with American NSA teams, his earlier amusement about Soviet crudity replaced by a grim determination. The embassy in London was swept for months. Technicians dismantled clocks, cut open plaster statues, and even removed the ornate woodwork from the ambassador's personal study. They found nothing remotely as sophisticated as the thing, but the process was revealing. The widespread nature of the Crude surveillance was confirmed. They found wires stapled into carpets, cheap acoustic mics under floorboards, and bulky transmitters in radiator casings. All the expected decoys that had successfully focused the attention of security teams for years. The lack of an immediate duplicate thing in other key locations offered a small, temporary reprieve, suggesting that the Spaso House operation may have been either a high-value prototype deployment or that the KGB had been extremely selective in its placement. Nevertheless, the risk was considered absolute. The second, long-term step was the development of new, permanent countermeasures. Since the thing was passive and required an external microwave beam to function, the technical solution was to make the embassy a hostile environment for that beam. This involved coating windows with ultra-thin, almost invisible metallic films designed to scatter or absorb microwave energy, and installing RF shielding in critical interior walls. More drastically, new protocols were established for active jamming. Instead of just searching for transmissions, key rooms were equipped with constant, low-power microwave noise generators. These devices flooded the area with random, broadband RF energy. The theory was simple. If the KGB tried to interrogate a passive resonator with a focus beam, their return signal would be hopelessly contaminated by the internal RF noise, rendering any conversation unintelligible. The unintended side effect was the occasional, severe interference with the embassy's own legitimate communications, a small price to pay for security. The era of trusting a clean sweep was over. The new Cold War technical doctrine was characterized by a perpetual, defensive RF fog. The discovery of the thing had not just exposed a security flaw, it had permanently shifted the counter-espionage paradigm from detection to proactive denial. Western services would now have to allocate massive resources not to find the powered bugs they expected, but to defend against the non-powered ghosts they now knew existed. May 1960. The United Nations Security Council meeting, New York City. For 3 years, the existence of the thing and the massive intelligence breach it represented remained one of the most closely guarded secrets of Western intelligence. The U.S. government feared exposing the extent of their vulnerability and simultaneously did not want to reveal the complexity of the Soviet technology, which might give the KGB an opportunity to further refine their designs. However, the political climate changed dramatically in May 1960 following the international crisis over the Soviet shooting down of the American U-2 spy plane piloted by Francis Gary Powers. The Soviet Union, led by Nikita Khrushchev, used the incident to launch a massive diplomatic and propaganda offensive, accusing the United States of aggressive, systematic espionage and undermining global peace efforts. The U.S. was reeling, politically exposed, and needing a dramatic countermove to demonstrate that both sides were engaged in deep, systematic espionage. President Dwight D. Eisenhower and his advisors decided to play their trump card, the highly classified, devastating discovery from Spaso House. The political utility of exposing the Soviet hypocrisy now outweighed the technical risks. On a dramatic afternoon at the United Nations, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., stood before the Security Council, holding a small, nondescript block of wood. He began by addressing the Soviet delegation's accusations of aggressive American spying. Then, with a theatrical flourish, he presented the carved Great Seal of the United States. This seal, Lodge announced, his voice carrying clearly across the chamber, was presented as a gift of friendship by Soviet schoolchildren to the American ambassador in Moscow, Mr. George Kennan, in 1952. For 7 years, it hung prominently in the ambassador's private study. Lodge then recounted the discovery of the hidden device, detailing its passive, non-powered nature, and explaining how it utilized an invisible microwave beam to eavesdrop on sensitive conversations. A technician standing by produced the actual tiny cavity resonator, the thing itself, now mounted on a clear plastic stand. Lodge held it up for the television cameras and the stunned delegates to see. This, he declared, pointing to the delicate diaphragm, is what Soviet schoolchildren were apparently taught to construct as a symbol of friendship. Not a power device, not a simple acoustic microphone, but a sophisticated, passive, radar-activated resonator. A gift of peace that was, in fact, an instrument of war. The revelation was a stunning success for American propaganda. It completely shifted the global narrative, presenting the USSR not just as a defensive victim, but as a deceitful, technically advanced aggressor capable of the most cynical form of espionage, using children as cover for a state-of-the-art spying operation. The image of the wooden seal, the gift, and the tiny device inside became a powerful, visceral symbol of Cold War betrayal. The Soviet delegation was visibly shaken, their carefully planned U-2 offensive instantly undermined. They could not deny the object's authenticity. Instead, their representative, Valerian Zorin, launched into a furious, non-specific counterattack, accusing the Americans of planting the device themselves for propaganda purposes, a claim too absurd to be effective. The diplomatic fallout was immediate, and the world now understood that the war of shadows was being fought with technologies they couldn't even imagine. June 1960. NSA Cryptologic Research Division, Fort Meade, Maryland. Following the public revelation at the UN, the pressure on the U.S. intelligence community intensified exponentially. The existence of the thing, now a matter of public record, galvanized efforts across the CIA, NSA, and specialized defense contractors to not only develop better countermeasures, but also to reverse engineer and deploy their own version of the passive bug technology. If the Soviets possessed this capability, the West could not afford to lag behind. The technical race had shifted from miniaturization and power efficiency to absolute stealth. Dr. Peter Jensen, now a key figure in the NSA's counterintelligence technology branch, led the effort. His team, utilizing the captured device as a blueprint, began the painstaking process of understanding the precise metallurgical and acoustic properties that made the thing so effective. The simplicity of a device was its greatest challenge. It was not a system of interconnected components, but a single, exquisitely tuned mechanical electronic instrument. The analysis revealed that the Soviet engineers had achieved an astonishing level of acoustic sensitivity with the diaphragm. It was thinner than any metal film the Americans had previously considered stable enough for sustained use. The material composition, a unique alloy, allowed it to vibrate faithfully to the low-amplitude pressure waves of human speech, while remaining incredibly robust against the powerful microwave interrogation beam. Crucially, the team realized the true ingenuity lay not just in the bug itself, but in the external interrogation radar the KGB used. The system required a highly stable, powerful, and narrowly focused microwave beam, a technological achievement in itself for the early 1950s. The receiver needed to be sensitive enough to detect minute frequency shifts, mere parts per million, in the reflected signal, all while filtering out the overwhelming static and reflections from the embassy building itself. The success of the thing was predicated on the KGB's parallel excellence in covert radar and signal processing. The immediate goal for the NSA team became twofold: replicate the passive resonator design, now internally dubbed the probe, and develop the necessary active interrogation radar system, AIRS, to make it operational. Replicating the probe proved complex. Early American prototypes suffered from low sensitivity, requiring the AIRS to be positioned impossibly close to the target. Others were too prone to feedback, creating an uncontrolled, high-pitched squeal when energized by the microwave beam. The NSA team spent nearly a year experimenting with different cavity shapes, spherical, elliptical, conical, and various alloys, attempting to match the Soviet balance of stability and acoustic fidelity. Meanwhile, the development of the American AIRS required breakthroughs in microwave antenna design and frequency stability. The required power output and beam focus were far beyond what was currently used in standard radar systems. The team had to build a mobile platform, disguised as an innocuous delivery van or utility vehicle, capable of holding a dish large enough to transmit and receive the high-gain signal without raising suspicion on a public street. This operational constraint further complicated the engineering, demanding a high power-to-size ratio that was difficult to achieve with the early generation of magnetrons. Jensen often mused to his team that the KGB's greatest intelligence coup was not the gathering of secrets, but the forcing of the Western technological agenda. They had compelled the massive redirection of resources and talent towards an entirely new branch of signals intelligence. The previous technical arrogance, the belief that the Soviet Union was inherently clumsy and backward in engineering, was now fully and painfully eradicated. Every technical report, every new surveillance sweep, and every countermeasure protocol was henceforth infused with a deep, paranoid respect for the enemy's ability to innovate outside the conventional Western framework. The race to master passive espionage technology was now on, spurred by the profound humiliation of having been completely blind to the device that hung, for years, directly above the ambassador's head. The implications extended beyond diplomatic security. Military command structures and high-value research labs were also now known to be vulnerable to similar passive resonant eavesdropping techniques. The sheer volume of material that needed to be secured, reassessed, and resecured, from the smallest gift to the largest piece of furniture, was staggering, crippling security budgets and demanding an entirely new generation of security engineers. The Cold War's technical battleground had just expanded exponentially, proving that the most dangerous weapon was often the one you couldn't even detect. The lessons learned from the simple, silent, wooden seal would shape counterintelligence for the next 50 years. October 1961. MI6 headquarters, London. The operational consequences of the thing were far-reaching, transforming the daily routines of intelligence officers worldwide. For Major Alan Breck, now promoted to a senior position focused on technical counterespionage, the professional environment had become defined by an omnipresent, chilling paranoia. The old certainties were gone. The most profound shift was the death of the secure perimeter. Before the thing, if a room was swept clean of power devices, officers believed their conversations were safe, at least from technical eavesdropping. Now, every space was treated as potentially compromised, not by internal wiring, but by an invisible, external force. Breck's briefing materials for new field agents emphasized the new reality. Assume every solid surface is a potential acoustic membrane. Assume any object with a cavity, a vase, a clock, a piece of artwork, is a passive resonator. Do not rely on electronic sweeps alone. The enemy no longer needs to penetrate the wall. They need only to reflect the sound. This led to the implementation of chatter protocol. Sensitive discussions were no longer held in designated offices, but often taken outside, to private, noisy parks, or held while walking briskly down busy sidewalks. Inside secure areas, agents adopted the use of white noise machines, acoustic scramblers that emitted a continuous, low-level static or masking sound. These devices were crude but effective against acoustic sensors like the Thing, overwhelming the delicate diaphragm with random noise and preventing a clean modulation of the microwave return signal. The psychological impact on the personnel was immense. The sight of a stationary vehicle parked outside an embassy, a white van, an electrical repair truck, or even a seemingly broken-down sedan, was no longer just a minor nuisance, but a potential active interrogation radar system, AIRS platform. Every window, every line of sight from a distant building, became a potential beam path. Field agents were trained to identify the subtle signs of a directional microwave antenna, a non-standard fixture on a roofline, or a slightly misaligned headlight on a distant vehicle, and to actively disrupt the line of sight during sensitive moments. Breck himself oversaw the development of a small, handheld microwave flicker detector. This device was designed to passively monitor the ambient microwave radiation in a room. It was too broadband to pinpoint a specific frequency, but if a KGB team was actively interrogating a passive bug, the momentary, intense pulse of the microwave beam would register as a spike on the detector's display. It didn't prevent the bugging, but it gave a critical confirmation of when a room was being listened to, a small, dark victory in the new age of paranoia. The ultimate irony was that the thing, a device of almost unbelievable elegance and simplicity, forced Western services to return to the crudest forms of security: sound masking, visual obstruction, and a crippling level of distrust towards every single piece of physical matter that crossed their threshold. The KGB had successfully instilled a paralyzing operational fear, forcing the expenditure of massive resources not on acquiring new secrets, but on securing old furniture. Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, Lincoln Laboratory, Cambridge, Massachusetts. A decade after its discovery, the immediate crisis caused by the thing had subsided, replaced by a sustained, technical engagement with the principles it embodied. At facilities like MIT's Lincoln Laboratory, the Soviet bug was no longer just an intelligence exhibit. It had become a foundational piece of electronic theory, a mandatory case study in the interaction between acoustics, materials science, and microwave physics. The device, which had so ruthlessly exposed the blind spots of Western technical arrogance, was now teaching the next generation of engineers how to think outside the paradigm. Dr. Eleanor Vance, a brilliant young physicist specializing in antenna theory, was tasked with writing the definitive technical analysis of the cavity resonator for the NSA's internal research papers. Her work was instrumental in formalizing the technical principles behind Lyon Theremin's achievement, shifting its classification from mere bug to a genuine technological breakthrough. Vance's analysis focused heavily on the energy transfer mechanism. She calculated that the efficiency of the power transfer from the external microwave beam to the tiny mechanical diaphragm, and back out again, modulated, was extraordinarily high, particularly for the frequency spectrum used. The resonance was so pure that it required minimal power expenditure from the KGB's external radar, allowing them to operate the system with lower power requirements, making their interrogation vans less conspicuous and their beam less likely to be detected by early warning systems. The key metric she emphasized was the Q factor, quality factor, a measure of a resonator's efficiency. The thing's Q factor was remarkably high, meaning the cavity rang for a very long time at its target frequency, concentrating energy and vastly improving the signal-to-noise ratio of the returned audio. We were taught to maximize power output for transmission, Vance explained in her classified lecture series to NSA engineers. Theremin taught us to maximize mechanical resonance for reflection. It's a completely inverted engineering goal. It forces us to treat the entire environment, including the objects within it, as potential antennae, not just the wires we run ourselves. The academic study of the thing led directly to several major advancements in completely unrelated fields. The need to quickly and passively identify nonlinear junctions in the presence of overwhelming background noise spurred developments in nonlinear junction detector, NLJD, technology, which eventually became the standard for modern counter-surveillance sweeps and, later, a staple in military ordnance detection. Furthermore, the principles of remote acoustic sensing via microwave interrogation contributed directly to early research into remote sensing and telemetry, particularly for inaccessible or hazardous environments where running power lines was impossible. The material science required to replicate the passive diaphragm spurred research into thin film deposition and novel metal alloys capable of maintaining structural integrity under high-frequency excitation. This research would later find applications in everything from computer memory chips to high-fidelity audio equipment, an ironic twist given the device's original acoustic function. Vance concluded her definitive paper by noting that the thing was a perfect example of how constraints breed ingenuity. The Soviet constraints, a shortage of miniaturized components and powerful batteries, forced airmen to bypass the established Western engineering paths and utilize fundamental physics in a radical new way. Western engineers, flush with post-war technological excess and an abundance of reliable power sources, had simply failed to anticipate a solution that eliminated the need for power altogether. The legacy of the wooden seal was therefore twofold. It was a chilling artifact of espionage and a powerful intellectual catalyst. It dismantled the self-satisfied belief in Western technological supremacy and forced a deep, introspective reorganization of technical security doctrine. From that point on, every security engineer, every physicist involved in communications had to work with the painful, undeniable truth that the KGB, by leveraging the brilliance of a forgotten musical inventor, had momentarily achieved a level of technical stealth that was quite literally years ahead of its time. The tiny metal cylinder was no longer just a bug. It was a blueprint for the physics of silent warfare. U.S. Embassy, London. Technical Security Detachment Office. More than 2 decades had passed since the condescending laughter in Berlin, and nearly 20 years since the quiet installation of the silent killer in Moscow. The Cold War had calcified into a state of permanent, technologically sophisticated tension. The initial global panic over the thing had evolved into institutionalized vigilance, embodied by a new generation of technical countermeasures officers. One such officer was a young, sharp-eyed physicist named Lieutenant Commander David Cross, a protege of Dr. Peter Jensen. Cross had never known the era of technological hubris. He had been trained in the shadow of the wooden seal. Cross's daily mandate was the proactive denial and constant vigilance doctrine born directly from the failure in Moscow. He oversaw a team that specialized in what was now known as non-cooperative target identification, finding electronic structures that had no desire to be found. He didn't search for heat or current. He searched for structural anomalies and unnatural resonances. His most prized piece of equipment was the third-generation nonlinear junction detector, NLJD, where the original 1957 model used a simple broadband sweep. Cross's device utilized an advanced chirp pulse radar system, which could sweep across multiple frequencies simultaneously and analyze the resulting harmonics with digital precision. This allowed his team to distinguish the faint, telltale nonlinear junction of a passive bug's diaphragm from the harmonic noise generated by mundane objects like rusty plumbing or the metal staples in drywall. However, the KGB was not static. They understood that the West had cracked the principle of Theremin's device. Their new challenge was to develop passive bugs that were acoustically and electromagnetically stealthier. Reports from double agents indicated that Soviet scientists were experimenting with resonators made from non-metallic, composite materials, ceramics, specialized plastics, and even glass, designed to reduce the NLJD's ability to detect the metallic diaphragm and antenna. They were also embedding the devices deeper, utilizing the structural materials of the building itself, making the resonance even harder to isolate. In the U.S. Embassy in London, Cross's team faced a new wave of persistent, low-level data leaks suggesting a successful installation in a high-traffic but supposedly swept conference room. The standard NLJD sweeps were clean. The white noise generators were active. Yet, highly detailed discussions were clearly being compromised. Cross, recalling the theoretical work done by Vance a decade earlier, decided to attempt a technique considered too complex for routine use: active acoustic excitation. Instead of waiting for the enemy's interrogation beam to trigger the bug, Cross would trigger it himself, but with sound. He sealed the conference room and flooded it not just with white noise, but with a complex pattern of ultra-low frequency, ULF, acoustic pulses, designed to shake any passive diaphragm at its resonant frequency without being noticeable to human hearing outside the room. Simultaneously, he positioned a specialized microwave receiver, his own small-scale version of the KGB's interrogation radar, to sweep the area within the room. The theory was that the ULF pulses would excite the diaphragm of any internal bug. If a passive bug was present, this mechanical vibration would cause the diaphragm to modulate the ambient RF noise already present in the room, creating a faint, unique electromagnetic flicker that a sensitive receiver could isolate. For hours, the sweep was silent. Then, over a particularly strong acoustic pulse, the receiver picked up an incredibly faint, repeating harmonic signature emanating from the ornate plaster ceiling cornice. It was a ceramic-coated, passive resonator, cleverly embedded directly into the plaster structure itself, requiring no wires or external fixings. It was the next evolution of the thing, harder to detect, yet still reliant on the core principle of Theremin's original design. The successful neutralization of this advanced passive bug in London, a direct result of lessons learned from the failure in Moscow, marked a crucial turning point. It proved that the intellectual debt to the thing was profound. The West had finally integrated the KGB's breakthrough into their own operational capability. The paranoia had yielded results, and the unsung hero of the countersweep was the device that had started the terror. The United States National Cryptologic Museum, Fort Meade, Maryland. The Cold War was entering its final, tense phase, but the physical artifacts of its earlier battles remained potent teaching tools. Behind a thick pane of non-reflective glass, under carefully controlled lighting, rested a small, dark piece of wood, the remains of the Great Seal of the United States plaque, and nestled beside it, gleaming faintly, was the tiny, silver-plated cylinder known simply as the Thing. It was no longer a secret, but a historical monument, a testament to a critical moment when Western technological hubris met a revolutionary, silent counterpunch. For the veterans who remembered the era of the crude cigar box bugs, like the now-retired Major Alan Breck, who occasionally lectured at the museum, the exhibit represented a painful, yet necessary, lesson in humility. The years of professional arrogance had cost the West 4 years of compromised diplomatic secrets. The object's continued presence in the museum served as a perpetual, stark reminder that the enemy's limitations should never be confused with a lack of ingenuity. The legacy of Lyon Theremin's design went far beyond diplomatic security. The concept of the passive, reflected signal became a core principle in military intelligence. It led to the development of early RFID, radio frequency identification, tagging, the ability to remotely interrogate a tiny, non-powered chip embedded in a supply chain item, all through an external reader beam. This technology, which revolutionized logistics, was an unlikely civilian grandchild of the most successful intelligence bug of the Cold War. In the realm of security, the Theremin principle demanded that all future electronic security designs prioritize electromagnetic hardening. Future generations of secure communications facilities, now known as SIFs, sensitive compartmented information facilities, were built not just with simple shielding, but with multi-layered, specialized materials designed to defeat both direct transmission and passive reflection. Walls were built with alternating layers of metal foil and acoustic damping materials. Windows were treated with conductive coatings to prevent microwave penetration. The secure room ceased to be just a shielded box and became a sophisticated, acoustically isolated electromagnetic cage. Moreover, the technical knowledge gained from reverse engineering the Thing led directly to the American development of its own successful suite of passive eavesdropping devices during the 1960s and 70s. This capability, deployed against adversarial targets, allowed the West to turn the KGB's technical victory back against them, leveraging the silent technology for their own intelligence gathering. The hunter had become the hunted, and the technology of the original spy had been democratized across the field of espionage. The ultimate irony, however, remained the original laugh. The initial technical superiority enjoyed by the British and Americans with their miniaturized, powered transmitters had blinded them to the one path the Soviets, constrained by material shortages and championed by an acoustic genius, would inevitably take: the path of powerless reflection. They were looking for the enemy's weakness in power supply. The enemy delivered a device that mocked the very need for power. As Breck would tell his occasional tour groups, pointing to the silver cylinder, "This little piece of metal is arguably the most valuable piece of intelligence captured in the entire Cold War, not for the secrets it contained, but for the fundamental truth it revealed. It taught us that in a war of secrets, the moment you become convinced of your own technological superiority, you are already losing." The enemy's greatest weapon was not its army, but its ability to force us to look in the wrong direction. The silent spy, born from wood and resonant metal, had ensured that no technical countermeasures officer in the West would ever again dismiss an object as just a hunk of wood. It hangs in a museum not just as a piece of history, but as a permanent, chilling mandate for perpetual vigilance and the absolute rejection of technological arrogance.